So, how does a relationship between two countries, two partners even, completely fall apart? That's what we're here to figure out. We're going to break down the long, complex story of the US and Venezuela and really get into the anatomy of how things escalated to an absolute breaking point.
Okay, so let's start at the end with a moment that just seemed impossible. In early 2026, the world woke up to this unbelievable headline. The sitting president of Venezuela was in US custody. I mean, think about that. This kind of thing just doesn't happen. It shatters all the norms of international relations where sovereignty is supposed to be sacred. This wasn't a coup, it wasn't an election, it was something totally different. And it left everyone asking one question.
And that's really the core question we're tackling here. An event this big doesn't just happen out of nowhere, right? It's the end result of years and years of pressure building up until it finally explodes. So, how did we get here? How does a relationship that was once a stable, even beneficial partnership completely unravel? Well, to figure that out, we've got to hit rewind and go way back.
All right, so Section 1, the partnership built on oil. We're starting back when cooperation, not conflict, was the name of the game.
This relationship wasn't just simple trade, it was truly symbiotic. Think of it like two puzzle pieces that fit together perfectly. The US had these special refineries down on the Gulf Coast that were basically built to handle Venezuela's unique type of heavy crude oil. So America got a reliable energy source, and for Venezuela, they got their number one customer, a guaranteed buyer providing billions of dollars that pretty much ran their entire country. It was a win-win. But, and this is a huge but, while everything looked great on the surface, underneath it all, things in Venezuela were starting to boil. That incredible oil wealth, it wasn't trickling down to the average person. You had massive inequality, and people were getting more and more frustrated with a political class they saw as corrupt. It was like a powder keg, just waiting for a spark. You could feel that some kind of radical change was on the horizon.
And that brings us to Section 2, the Chavez turning point. The year is 1999, and this is the moment everything, and I mean everything, changes. So, Hugo Chavez comes to power with this idea he calls the Bolivarian Revolution. At its core, it was super simple but also revolutionary. Venezuela for Venezuelans. He wanted the state to take back full control of its national resources, especially oil, and to stop following Washington's lead on foreign policy. This wasn't just a small shift, it was a direct challenge to the entire foundation of the old US-Venezuela relationship. And look, this wasn't just rhetoric. The changes came fast. The government basically moved in on the oil industry, renegotiating or just flat out canceling contracts with foreign companies. At the same time, Chavez started making new friends, alliances with US rivals like Cuba, Russia, and China. And he wasn't quiet about it. He became one of the loudest critics of US foreign policy out there. Every single one of these moves was like taking a sledgehammer to the old partnership. So even though we didn't have an open conflict right away, the game had totally changed. The trust was just gone. Cooperation was replaced by suspicion on both sides. The foundation of that old relationship didn't just crack, it was fundamentally broken. There was really no going back.
Okay, Section 3. After Chavez dies, his successor, Nicolás Maduro, takes over and things get a lot more dangerous. The tension that was simmering before, it's about to spiral into this vicious cycle, what we're calling the escalation feedback loop. And this timeline, man, it just shows you how fast the bottom fell out. Right after Maduro takes power, global oil prices crash. For a country that depends almost entirely on oil, it was like a hurricane hitting the economy. You get hyperinflation, food shortages, a total humanitarian crisis, millions of people end up fleeing. And as this is all happening, the US steps in with major economic sanctions. The pressure keeps ramping up until 2019, when Washington takes this incredible step. It recognizes an opposition leader, Juan Guaido, as the legitimate president. Okay, pay close attention here because this is one of the most crucial parts of the whole story, the sanctions cycle. The idea from the US side was pretty straightforward. Apply sanctions, pressure the leadership, force a change. But what actually happened was kind of the opposite. The Venezuelan state didn't crumble, it adapted. It concentrated its power just to survive. For example, the military got put in charge of things like food distribution. That gave them control over scarce resources and in turn ensured their loyalty to the government. So you get this crazy paradox. The worse the crisis got for the people, the tighter the grip the elite had on power. And this right here is why there was no way out. It was one crisis, but two totally different stories. From Washington's perspective, Maduro was a dictator, running a failed state, and sanctions were a necessary evil to bring about democracy. But from Caracas's view, they saw themselves under attack, the victim of an economic war by an imperial power. They saw sanctions as illegal punishment against the whole country. When you have two sides that are so fundamentally opposed, who both believe they're on the right side of history, well, there's just no middle ground, no room to talk. That move in 2019, recognizing Juan Guaido, that was the big gamble. It was the peak of the maximum pressure strategy. The whole idea was to split the military, to get them to flip, but it didn't work. The military stayed loyal to Maduro. And when that gambit failed, it was a massive turning point. It felt like all the political and economic options had been tried and exhausted. The whole thing became a zero-sum game. Now it was win or lose with no other way out.
This brings us to our last section, from sanctions to force. The political pressure didn't work, the economic pressure didn't work, so the U.S. strategy started to change, and that clear line between peace and war, it started to get really blurry. So to be clear, we're not talking about a full-on invasion, but the posture absolutely changed. Suddenly, there are more U.S. Navy ships in the Caribbean, more surveillance flights gathering intelligence. And then there's this really clever reframing of the whole issue. The U.S. starts labeling top Venezuelan officials as narco-traffickers. Why? Because that allows for military-like actions, like physically stopping and seizing oil tankers, but framing it as a counter-narcotics operation. The pressure was no longer just economic. It was becoming physical.
But why all this focus on Venezuela? Why such intense, sustained pressure? Because it had become something much bigger. It was a geopolitical test case. It was a test of American power in its own traditional sphere of influence, its backyard. Could the U.S. still dictate outcomes in a region it had long dominated, especially when that country was rich in oil and backed by rivals like Russia and China? This wasn't just about one country anymore. For Washington, American credibility itself felt like it was on the line. And that quote right there, it just nails it. Momentum is difficult to stop. That's the key to this whole thing. The breaking point in 2026 wasn't some sudden decision made in a crisis room. It was the end of a long road. It was the result of years of decisions, sanctions, and failed strategies all piling on top of each other, creating this unstoppable forward motion. It was like a runaway train.
And that's where we end up. By this point, all the off-ramps were gone. Diplomacy, dead. The big political gamble, failed. The sanctions, they hadn't worked as intended. There were no alternatives left on the table. So the whole mindset shifted. It wasn't about trying to find a solution anymore. It was about preparing for what felt like an inevitable clash. Patience had run out, and preparation was the only thing left.
Which brings us right back to the beginning, back to that shocking moment. We've just walked through the anatomy of how that moment became not just possible, but maybe even predictable. But it leaves us with the biggest question of all. After decades of pressure building and building, once it's all released in one single explosive moment, what in the world happens next?